What's up, everybody? Rocking a new setup today, a little bit closer to the camera this time. Today, talking about these guys, Mavic Pro 2, Mavic Pro 1. This guy's dead, but he's just here for show. So let's get into it. So I thought it looked cooler having this here, but it's dead. So that's gonna go over there. Today our main focus is the Mavic Pro 2, Mavic Pro 1. Is it really worth getting the Mavic Pro 2? We're gonna do some field testing and a bunch of other stuff, and we'll see how that goes. But first, I wanna go over a few specs of both of these, just to kind of go over the major differences. And then after that, we're gonna go outside, do some flight, take some video, see how they look, and see if it's really that big of a difference. The sensor on the Mavic Pro 1 is a little bigger than a 1/2 inch, which is pretty small. The sensor on the Mavic Pro 2 is a 1-inch sensor, a full 1-inch sensor. The Mavic Pro 1 has a 17-ish megapixel sensor, and the Mavic Pro 2 has a straight up 20 megapixel sensor. The Mavic Pro 1 does have a 1.8 degree better, wider field of view than the Mavic Pro 2, but honestly, I don't think anybody would really notice that difference. The next thing that the Mavic Pro 1 actually comes in as the winner is focal distance. The Mavic Pro 1 has a focal distance of 0.5 meters up to infinity. Mavic Pro 2 has a minimum of a 1 meter focal distance. The next major difference is the ISO range of these two drones, which is actually pretty cool for the Mavic Pro 2. The Mavic Pro 1 goes from 100 to 3200 ISO for video, and the Mavic Pro 2 goes from 100 to 6400 ISO for video. Now on the bigger side, the ISO for photo for the 1 is 100 to 1600, whereas the Mavic Pro 2 goes from 100 to 3200. That's if you're in auto mode. If you change to manual photo mode, where you can pick your own settings, it goes all the way up to 12,800, which I'm not quite sure why you would need that high on a drone for a photo, but it's there if you need it. Next is the image size. This is for photo. The image size for the Mavic Pro 1 is 4000 by 3000, which is a 4:3, and the Mavic Pro 2 is a 5472 by 3648, which is an image size of 3:2 instead of 4:3. Shutter speeds remain the same on both. That hasn't made a change, which is fine. It goes all the way up to 8,000 and all the way back to 8 seconds. Video shooting though is a pretty cool upgrade. So the maximum frame rate the Mavic 1 could shoot in 4K was 30 frames per second. The maximum frame rate it could hit in 1080p was 96 frames per second. And if you wanted to get 120 frames per second, you had to go all the way down to 720p. Whereas the Mavic Pro 2 can do 4K 30, 2.7K, 60 frames per second, and then full HD 120 frames per second, which is pretty awesome. I find myself not using slow-mo on drones often, but that is really cool. You can do up to 120 frames per second. Next is a really big improvement is the bit rate. Mavic Pro 1 is a maximum of 60 megabits per second. Mavic Pro 2 is 100 megabits per second, which is pretty awesome. I know most Sony DSLR cameras shoot at 100 megabits per second, even in 4K. Canon cameras shoot around 400. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the bit rate of this drone. And then lastly, as for the image quality, we're gonna talk about color space. The Mavic Pro 1 does have a D-Log setting. I couldn't find accurate data on DJI's website if it was 8-bit or not, but I'm assuming it's going to be D-Log 8-bit. That would make sense. The Mavic Pro 2 does D-Log M, it's called. It's in 10-bit. It also has a HDR mode in video, which is called HLG 10-bit. So you have a little bit more dynamic range and leeway with the Mavic Pro 2. And then next, let's just do the physical parts, which is pretty simplistic. The Mavic Pro 2 is actually bigger. It's kind of maybe hard to see on video, but right here is a good example. The Mavic Pro 1 is slightly shorter. One of the major actual physical differences of these drones is the sensors. So the Mavic Pro 2 has a buttload of sensors. So the Mavic Pro 1 has two sensors up front and then some sensors on bottom. The Mavic Pro 2 has the same sensors on the front, same sensors on the bottom, plus some extras. It has some sensors on the side, on each side. It also has 2 sensors in the back. You're basically covered 360 degrees around this drone from obstacle avoidance, which is really awesome. And then as for battery life, the Mavic Pro 1 has like 24 minutes-ish around, and then the Mavic Pro 2 has a battery life around 30 to 31 minutes. And then the Mavic Pro 2 has the new propellers, kind of like the Mavic Pro Platinum, that are quieter. But that's kind of it for the general spec overview. Let's head outside. We're gonna test a few things and I'll talk about that when we're out there. Let's go.
All right, so we're at the park. It's not the most scenic place to fly a drone. I don't really have much around here to do that. It's sunny and cloudy. The clouds are kind of just coming and going, so we might have a good test of the dynamic range. I highly recommend before flying, even if you are not 107 certified, that you check an app like AirMap to make sure it's good to fly where you're trying to fly, because you don't need a license to get those apps, and it's always good to make sure you're not going to get in trouble. So this is where we're going to be posting up to get some drone shots, and we'll go from there. So we're gonna start at a standard picture profile for both. We're gonna do 4K, 1080, and 2.7K at their highest frame rates, or 24 if they don't do a high frame rate. And then we're gonna do it again at a D-Log profile, just the standard D-Log, not the HDR D-Log on the Mavic Pro 2. And then lastly, we're gonna do automatic settings, most likely, because that's going to be the easiest way to make it similar. I don't wanna have to mess with the settings because they have different image processors and sensors, so the same settings might look a lot different or darker. So we're just gonna do auto for now. All right, so we got our shots. It's really cold, my fingers are falling off. Oh, it's cold. All right, so there were other frame rates I could have done. But the issue is, one, it was freezing. I'm so cold. I had to take my glove off to use the drone remote and my fingers are done. I could have done every frame rate at every resolution that is offered. However, I figured 1080 24 frames and 4K 24 frames were generally the same thing. Most likely you're gonna even have a higher bitrate at 4K than 1080, so the picture would look better. And you know, so we're just gonna compare general things. So let's take a look at this footage and see what it looks like.
So my timeline here is a 4K timeline for YouTube. So I did have to scale up the 2K and the 1080 footage, but I scaled it up just till it hits the top and bottom of the frame. So first we're gonna look at the 4K footage and we're gonna compare them side by side. The Mavic 1 footage is going to be on the right, the Mavic 2 is going to be on the left, and let's just get into it. All right, so this is the 4K version. As you can see, the Mavic 2 on the left, Mavic 1 on the right. You can look at the sharpness and the clarity on the Mavic Pro 2 on the left and how you can see the detail in quite a bit of things. It looks a little more flat than the Mavic 1, but it is a pretty good image. And then we look at the 2.7K image on the Mavic Pro 1 and 2. It's a very similar thing where the Mavic 1 looks pretty color graded and the Mavic 2 has more of a standard color profile. And then as for 1080, it doesn't really look like 1080. It could be because I upscaled to 1080 in a 4K timeline, but it does look kind of blurry, and these both did seem to have like a crop on them when I put them at a higher frame rate, so that could also be an issue. We look at the log footage, very similar, more dynamic range, more clarity. It's not as blurry, the details aren't fuzzy, but both of them look really good. I tried to do some fast movements and a higher frame rate on these just to show you what it looks like in a higher frame rate. As you can tell, the Mavic 2 had a really smooth looking image. And then as for 1080 log, same deal as before. You kind of lose a lot of resolution, it almost looks like. It doesn't really look like a full 1080. But this just could be because I'm in a very high frame rate on both of these drones. And then the 4K log color, this was just a standard LUT I threw on them. I did not edit them any further than the LUT. It's specifically a LUT for the DJI D-Log color profile. But as you can see, you do have quite a bit of colors back with the 2 and a lot of detail, whereas the Mavic 1 kind of looks like you tried really hard to color correct, and it kind of just looks like you lost a lot of exposure when you threw a LUT on there. So not a huge fan of color correcting the Mavic 1. The Mavic 2 has a lot more leeway when color correcting log footage, but they both do a pretty good job in a flat profile, but I would highly recommend shooting the Mavic 1 in a standard profile because log is quite difficult with the DJI. But that's kind of it for the colors. I hope you learned a little bit of something about these drones and maybe it'll help you make a decision. I kind of wanted just to give you the raw-ish look at the files. I definitely recommend getting the Mavic Pro 2. I love the colors, I love the dynamic range and everything about it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe because why not? And hope you learned something, and I'll see you guys on the next one.